60 years on from Doctor Who's first transmission back in 1963, we fans are truly spoilt for choice when it comes to consuming and revisiting the show on home media. When the series came back in 2005, DVD releases came quick and fast, often only a couple of months after the episodes had been screened on BBC One. By the 2010s, the series was also being issued on the high-definition Blu-ray format, as well as being available for digital download. Today in the 2020s, if you want to access any episode of Doctor Who, both classic and modern, it's relatively straightforward to do so, as you have several options available. But before the big return in 2005, this wasn't necessarily the case. Before DVD really took off during the noughties, the dominant format of home media was undoubtedly VHS, which had first been introduced towards the end of the 1970s. Though the cassettes were bulky and the technology had its faults, VHS, together with their VCR playback machines, had worked their way up to becoming a staple bit of kit in many households. For Doctor Who fans, they would get their first chance to officially purchase and re-watch past stories at their leisure in the final few months of 1983. Revenge of the Cybermen was the first title to hit the shelves, presented in an omnibus format, at a rather steep price of nearly £40, quite a lot of money back then. This began the Doctor Who VHS range, which would run continuously for the next 20 years. So whilst fans knew it would take some time to build up a complete Doctor Who collection, the fact that the ball was rolling was exciting enough. Before VHS, you either had to rely on BBC repeats, which before the 90s were exceptionally rare, or perhaps you knew a friend who'd been able to access a bootleg copy off the black market. Though in terms of quality, you were taking your chances. But for those who'd been watching stories on their first transmission, just how long would they have to wait before they could view these adventures again? We're going to go through the eras of the first 7 Doctors and see which stories took the longest time to grace their way to home media, the VHS format in particular. Just a few ground rules: I'm measuring the gap in time from the broadcast date of the final episode of a story to when it was released on tape. I'm not going to be including repeats. This includes those on both the BBC and UK Gold, which from 1992 started repeating Doctor Who episodes continuously. I'll give mention to them if necessary, but they aren't the focus today. Second of all, when it comes to missing episodes, I'll be excluding them from this exercise. Whilst surviving episodes of certain stories did make their way to VHS, they were not presented as a complete package, even if the sets they came with included a soundtrack CD or narrated links. Only stories with all episodes intact will be covered in this video. So without further ado, let's start from the beginning. Or better yet, let's start from the end and work back to the beginning. The Sylvester McCoy era mainly lasted between 1987 and 1989, though some would argue the first half of the Wilderness years extends the 7th Doctor's tenure until 1996. 3 seasons of 4 stories each were broadcast on BBC One, so how quickly were fans able to assemble a complete collection? The ball began rolling fairly quickly with The Curse of Fenric, which released in February 1991, just a year and 3 months after the story concluded on TV. A fun bonus was that this release contained several scenes not seen in the broadcast version. Fans of McCoy would then have to wait a long time before the next VHS release, which would be the pseudo-25th anniversary story, Silver Nemesis. Issued on tape 4 years and 4 months after finishing transmission, like Fenric, this would be another special release. For it not only contained unbroadcast scenes, it also included an American-made documentary that at the time had not been screened or seen in the UK. A nice treat considering the tape was released during the programme's 30th anniversary year. 1993 also saw the VHS release of Remembrance of the Daleks, bundled together with The Chase in a special Dalek tin. Hitting shop shelves in September, it marked a gap of nearly 5 years between the end of transmission and a home media release, for one of the best Doctor Who stories of all time. 1994 saw Ghostlight come out 4 years and 7 months after its BBC One screening, and in 1995 the final classic Who tale, Survival, was finally issued on VHS. 5 years and 10 months after the final episode brought the 26-year-old show to a supposed close. The gaps began to get bigger, like with the season 24 finale, Dragonfire. Fans would have to wait 6 years before it was available on video, which eventually came in December 1993. Time and the Rani saw a 7-year and 10-month gap between its broadcast and video release, whereas Paradise Towers had to wait a full 8 years, both stories finally being added to fans' shelves in 1995. Battlefield extended this gap by half a year when its video release finally arrived in the March of 1998. It had been 8.5 years since its original transmission. The Happiness Patrol, one of my favourites, had to wait almost 9 years before fans could officially get the chance to purchase it, also ranking it 3rd place in terms of gaps between broadcast and VHS release. 2nd place goes to the season 25 finale, The Greatest Show in the Galaxy. It was released in the January of 2000, 11 years after the story originally came to a close in the January of 1989. But that's nothing compared to our 1st place winner for the McCoy era, which you may have worked out by now is Delta and the Bannermen. Arguably the peak of campness that Season 24 is often remembered for, the romp at a Wales holiday resort wouldn't see a release on VHS until March of 2001, marking a 13-year and 4-month gap. But if you think that's a long time, just you wait. We're only getting started. The Colin Baker era lasted between 1984 and 1986, the Sixth Doctor's time on air being cut criminally short by various behind-the-scenes dramas at the BBC. With only 8 stories to consider, and counting Season 23 as one whole adventure, you'd think assembling a complete Colin Baker collection on VHS would have been achieved relatively quickly. It may surprise you that the first Sixth Doctor releases wouldn't arrive until 1992, 6 years after the era concluded on TV, and a full 9 years into the Doctor Who VHS range. This release was the Sixth Doctor's debut, The Twin Dilemma, a story that doesn't deserve the hate it gets, quite frankly. In terms of gaps, the shortest goes to Season 23, The Trial of a Time Lord. Released in a lovely TARDIS tin as one complete package, its October 1993 arrival marked a near 7-year gap. Vengeance on Varos had arrived earlier during the May of 1993, but as a Season 22 story, its gap is longer, standing at 8 years and 4 months. The final release of 1993 for Old Sixie came in November, with The Two Doctors, an excellent story, one arriving 8 years and 8 months after the end of its original transmission. The aforementioned Twin Dilemma presents a gap of 8 years and 2 months, but now we're going to leap into double figures. The Mark of the Rani arrived in the summer of 1995, nearly 10.5 years from its first airing on BBC One. For our top 3 of this era, third place goes to Time Lash. Released to VHS in January 1998, this finished up with a 12-year and 10-month gap between first broadcast and home media release. Second place goes to the Season 22 finale, Revelation of the Daleks. One of the most underrated Doctor Who stories of all time, this adventure came bundled with Planet of the Daleks in a special tin set, released in November 1999. This results in a gap of 14 years and 8 months. But now we jump from the finale to the opener, as Attack of the Cybermen takes first place in the Colin Baker era. The last 6-year adventure to reach VHS, bundled with the 10th Planet in November of 2000, a full 15 years and 10 months after original broadcast. So if you were a particular fan of this story, and assuming you weren't able to catch any repeats during the 90s, you would have had to wait a very long time to experience this again. But as we go back in time, you'll notice that these gaps only continue to increase. The Peter Davison era lasted between 1982 and 1984, comprised of 3 seasons and a 20th anniversary special. The story with the shortest gap to a VHS release is that said special, The Five Doctors. It was actually one of the very first Doctor Who tapes on the format, releasing in September of 1985, a little under 2 years from its premiere on Children in Need. Fifth Doctor fans would then have to wait until 1992 for another of his stories to reach the format, the first of which being his swan song, The Caves of Androzani. The gap here stands at 7 years and 10 months. Widening that gap next is a tie between Mordrin Undead and Resurrection of the Daleks at 9 years and 9 months. A 2-month lead is achieved by both Terminus and Enlightenment, wrapping up the Black Guardian trilogy. The Fifth Doctor's debut, Castrovalva, took just over 10 years to reach VHS. Similarly to Earthshock, by the time that eventually reached the format in September of 1992. Arc of Infinity took a little over 11 years, whereas Warriors of the Deep and Snake Dance took closer to 12. The Visitation and Black Orchid, which were bundled together, took nearly 12.5 years to see a release on video, whereas Kinder and the King's Demons took almost 13 years to do the same. The Awakening and Frontios were released together in March of 1997, just over 13 years from their original broadcast. Taking third place for the Fifth Doctor's era is Planet of Fire, finishing with a gap of 14.5 years by the time it reached VHS in September of 1998. The silver medal goes to the Season 19 finale, Time Flight, an often maligned story. By the time it reached home video in the July of 2000, it had been 18 years and 4 months since it had brought Season 19 to a close. However, that falls behind our winner for this era, which goes quite easily to 4 to Doomsday. The second adventure for the newly regenerated Fifth Doctor finished transmission in late January 1982. It wouldn't be available for official purchase until September of 2001, achieving a grand gap of 19 years and 8 months, a staggering time frame to say the least. And if you're wondering if we're going to cross the 20-year mark, just you wait. The Tom Baker era is the longest of Classic Who, lasting from 1974 all the way until 1981. With 7 seasons and 42 stories in total, unless they all came at once, getting a complete set of Tom Baker adventures was always going to take a great deal of time. It may come as no surprise that the story with the shortest gap was the first Doctor adventure to come to VHS, that being the aforementioned Revenge of the Cybermen, being accessible just 8 years and 5 months since it originally concluded in the May of 1975. The second Who release on VHS was another Fourth Doctor tale, The Brain of Morbius, which presented a gap of 8 years and 6 months. Pyramids of Mars was another early Who tape, with a gap of 9 years and 3 months when it hit shelves in the February of 1985. The Robots of Death followed in 1986, with a similar gap between transmission and VHS release also. We reach double figures now, with the Fourth Doctor swan song, Logopolis, taking a full 11 years to reach VHS. An 11.5-year gap was observed by fan favourite City of Death, with a similar time frame being achieved by the talents of Wang Chiang, by the time it was released to tape in November of 1988. The Keeper of Traken took 12 years and 4 months to come to VHS, whereas Terror of the Zygons would take over 13, despite being one of the earlier releases in the range. Several Tom Baker stories took over 14 years to reach the format, including The Ark in Space, Destiny of the Daleks, The Deadly Assassin, and The Mask of Mandragora, the latter falling just shy of a 15-year gap. One that did cross that line was Image of the Fendal, at 15 years and 4 months. Even more Fourth Doctor stories took well over 16 years, including all of Season 16, the Keats Time season, The Leisure Hive, The Sontaran Experiment and Genesis of the Daleks, which were bundled together, and the E-Space trilogy. The opener of which, Full Circle, technically marked 17 years gap between end of original transmission and VHS release. Another adventure that took 17 years was Tom Baker's first stab at the character, Robot, which eventually came out in January 1992. The gap continues to widen, stories taking over 18 years to come out on home video, including Planet of Evil and The Seeds of Doom. Crossing into 19 years gap are tales such as Nightmare of Eden, The Android Invasion, and The Hand of Fear, which would you believe is one of the more obscure Doctor Who tapes. This was due to much of the catalogue being discontinued from sales shortly after its release in early 1996, resulting in copies not being impossible to find, but certainly more scarce. But perhaps that's a story for another day. And so we cross the 20-year barrier. That's right, if you weren't catching repeats on UK Gold or watching a second-hand copy loaned to you from a mate, the following adventures you'd have to wait over 2 decades before getting the chance to own or see them again. First up for the Fourth Doctor is Horror of Fang Rock, with a gap of 20 years and 10 months. Pushing further outward is the Season 15 finale, The Invasion of Time, taking a full 22 years to reach home video. The Face of Evil took 22 years and 4 months, and whilst Megalos took a similar amount of time, it was one of the last VHS releases of Doctor Who ever, being issued in 2003. The Creature from the Pit inched closer towards a 23-year gap, but that line was officially crossed by The Horns of Naimon and by our third place winner, The Sunmakers, standing at 23 years and 7 months gap between original transmission concluding and a release on VHS in July of 2001. Second place also goes to a Season 15 adventure, that being Underworld, which finally arrived to tape during March of 2002, a full 24 years and 2 months after concluding originally in January of 1978. Finally, our winner is also a Season 15 tale, a season that seemingly doesn't get a great deal of admiration these days, and that story is The Invisible Enemy. Despite being the adventure that would introduce the Doctor's ever-popular companion, K9, it would take just shy of 25 years before fans could enjoy the story on VHS when it was finally released in September of 2002, a time when the DVD range was well underway. So we sailed past 20 years, and almost crossed 25 years, and as we stretch further back along the Doctor's timeline, you'll see that fans of the first 3 incarnations in particular would have to extend their patience for as long as they could. The Jon Pertwee era lasted between 1970 and 1974, comprising of 5 seasons and a total of 24 stories. Whilst all stories still existed, not all of them could be presented in their original colour when it came to their VHS release, a factor the DVD range was able to almost rectify. The shortest gaps for the third Doctor's time in the TARDIS come with not 1, but 2 adventures featuring their deadliest enemy, the Daleks. Death to the Daleks, when released to video in July of 1987, marked a 13-year and 4-month gap since the end of its first broadcast. Day to the Daleks, despite releasing a year earlier on VHS, marked a further year's gap from its successor, standing at 14.5 years. The Time Warrior took almost 15.5 years to reach videotape, whilst the Third Doctor's swan song, Planet of the Spiders, took almost 17. Two Tales took over 18 years to see a VHS release, these being Jon Pertwee's first story, Spearhead from Space, and the 10th anniversary story, The Three Doctors, though both stories had been consistently repeated over the years. Moving across the 20-year mark, The Claws of Axos, both The Curse and Monster of Peladon, and The Demons all took over 21 years before reaching VHS. Carnival of Monsters, Frontier in Space, and Terror of the Autons all took over 22 years, the latter marking the first time that the serial had been available in full colour since original transmission. Another restoration to colour was Doctor Who and the Silurians, which took over 23 years, as did The Green Death, The Sea Devils, and the Season 7 finale, Inferno. And now it's official, we're crossing the quarter-of-a-century gap as we continue through the Third Doctor's era. First up is Planet of the Daleks, finally being available to buy 26.5 years after its first broadcast concluded. The Mind of Evil was next, standing at 27 years and 2 months, though this was presented entirely in black and white as colour prints were not available and restoration techniques were not advanced enough to attempt a recolorization. The Season 9 finale, The Time Monster, took a whopping 29 years and 5 months to reach home video, as did Invasion of the Dinosaurs at 29 years and 8 months. Fun fact, this was also the last individual complete serial to be released on VHS in October of 2003, 20 years after the range first began with Revenge of the Cybermen. Episode 1, titled Invasion, was presented in black and white as no colour prints exist, both then and now. The DVD release attempted to recolorization, though due to various technical factors, it isn't as polished as other stories that received this treatment. As we reach our top 3 for the Jon Pertwee era, we're crossing another milestone. Our bronze goes to Colony in Space, which holds an immense 30.5-year gap by the time it eventually saw a release in November 2001, alongside The Time Monster in a special Master-themed tin set. Pipping it by 3 months to take second place is The Mutants, another late release to the VHS range when it came out in February of 2003. So which story takes the crown? It is of course one of my all-time favourites, The Ambassadors of Death. This took a mind-blowing 32 years to reach VHS, eventually arriving in May of 2002. This release saw roughly half of the serial presented in colour, the remainder being in black and white. Restoring The Ambassadors of Death to colour was no easy feat, and indeed the DVD release was continuously delayed, finally arriving in 2012, presenting fans the opportunity to watch the story in full colour for the first time in over 40 years. The VHS release, though, would have been seen as a huge step up at the time, for when it was repeated on UK Gold sporadically throughout the 90s, it was presented entirely in black and white, and the quality of some of the episodes was less than satisfactory for broadcast. But if I'd had to wait a full 32 years to own this story and enjoy it again, given how good it is, I'd argue it's worth the wait. But we're going further back, to the days of black and white, where the gaps have the potential to grow even wider. The Patrick Troughton era lasted between 1966 and 1969, comprised of 3 seasons and a total of 21 stories. Now, by the time the VHS range came to a close in 2003, less than a third of those stories existed in their entirety, just 6. A few disclaimers before we go further. The Invasion was released as a standalone VHS in June of 1993. 2 of its 8 episodes are missing, their absence filled in by new narration links by Nicholas Courtney, who of course played the Brigadier. Given it's technically not complete, I'm not throwing it into our ranking, but just for fun, the gap between end of broadcast and VHS release stands at 24.5 years. Other partially missing stories featuring the Second Doctor did see home video treatment, such as The Ice Warriors, which came out in November of 1998. The 4 surviving episodes were presented, with the missing 2 being presented via soundtrack and corresponding images. This release again isn't being considered for the ranking, but the gap stands at just under 31 years. The then sole surviving episode of The Underwater Menace was also included in the set, with its gap standing at 31 years and 9 months. The final partially surviving stories from the Troughton era that saw a VHS release would include The Faceless Ones and The Web of Fear, as part of a special set released in November of 2003. The gaps, understandably, broke new ground, with The Web of Fear standing at 35 years and 8 months, and The Faceless Ones at a staggering 36.5 years. But again, these stories are incomplete. We'll now examine the fully intact Second Doctor stories, and you may be relieved to hear that the gaps aren't quite so vast. First up is The Seeds of Death, at one time the only complete 6-part Patrick Troughton story. Being one of the first videos in the range, releasing in 1985, the gap here falls below 2 decades, standing at 16 years and 4 months. However, we jump straight back over that line with the second Doctor swan song, The War Games. The mammoth 10-part adventure took 20 years and 8 months to reach home video, eventually doing so in February of 1990. The BBC seemed to burn through most of their existing second Doctor catalogue during the first few years of the 90s, with the first 2 stories of Season 6, The Dominators and The Mind Robber, also seeing a release in 1990, both of which taking either just under or bang on 22 years to do so. The Dominators also takes our 3rd place for this era, again just accounting for complete stories. The Crotons just crossed the 22-year mark, being released to tape in 1991, and takes 2nd place. Our winner here is the much revered Tomb of the Cybermen, which was rushed to VHS in May 1992 after having recently been discovered in Hong Kong of all places. Despite its fast issuing on home video, the gap from original transmission still stands at 24 years and 8 months, taking the gold for this era. Obviously, had I included the partially surviving stories into this, that honour would have been withdrawn, but it's important to remember that several Second Doctor stories never saw any kind of VHS release. The Power of the Daleks, the Moonbase, the Macra Terror, the Evil of the Daleks, the Abominable Snowmen, the Enemy of the World, Fury from the Deep, all of which have either seen a release on DVD or Blu-ray via animation, or their original episodes being found, they didn't get such treatment in the days of video cassettes. At the time of making this video, the surviving episodes of The Wheel in Space and The Space Pirates saw a release on the Lost in Time DVD box set, and The Highlanders hasn't seen any kind of home release at all. Not yet, anyway. Last but not least, we move to the days of the very first Doctor Who. The William Hartnell era lasted between 1963 and 1966, comprised of 3 full seasons and 2 adventures from a 4th, totaling 29 stories. By the time the VHS range concluded in 2003, 17 of those existed in their complete form. Just to state again, while some partially surviving Hartnell stories did reach VHS, they wouldn't be included in this ranking. The first Doctor swan song, in fact, The 10th Planet, was one such release, despite its 4th and final episode missing from the archives. Arriving on home video in November of 2000, it marked just over 34 years from when the Doctor's first regeneration was showcased on TV. The Crusade, the only partially missing adventure from Season 2, saw a release on VHS in July of 1999, bundled together with the subsequent story, The Space Museum. The 2 missing episodes were compensated for by new linking narration by William Russell, as well as a soundtrack CD of the missing episodes also. This release marked a 34-year and 3-month gap, but perhaps the longest for partially missing stories is observed by The Reign of Terror. With its 4 remaining episodes bundled together with The Faceless Ones and Web of Fear, both also partially missing, given that this adventure was from all the way back in Season 1, the gap here is astounding, especially as this set was the very last Doctor Who VHS release ever, arriving in time for the programme's 40th anniversary in November of 2003. Given that The Reign of Terror concluded in September of 1964, this marks an eye-watering gap of 39 years and 2 months. As black and white repeats were less frequent than colour stories, it's hard to imagine that those who originally were watching in 1964 would have to wait nearly 4 decades before getting the chance to officially see it again. But now we move on to the complete stories from the First Doctor's era, and look at the gaps they occupied before fans could spend their hard-earned cash in a quest to own them. The shortest gap actually stands at 25 years and 4 months. Over a quarter of a century is the shortest amount of time between the conclusion of a Hartnell-era story and a home video release. The story in question that takes this honour would be The Daleks, which was split into 2 tapes when it hit shelves in June 1989. It was also the very first William Hartnell story to reach the format. Ironic how the sequel serial, The Dalek Invasion of Earth, comes up next at 25 years and 5 months by the time it hit VHS in May 1990. The Web Planet came some months later, in September 1990, marking a 25-year-and-a-half gap. The very first Doctor Who adventure ever, An Unearthly Child, took a little over 26 years to become purchasable, being able to do so in February of 1990. Like with the second Doctor, it seems that the BBC wanted to release as much black and white content as possible during the early 90s before focusing on colour stories. Crossing the 28-year barrier are stories like The Chase and The Aztecs, and we continue to approach the Big 3-0 as The Rescue and The Romans, released together in a double video pack, took over 29.5 years to hit shop shelves. Sailing past the 30-year point includes serials like the Season 3 finale, The War Machines, taking just shy of 31 years by the time the VHS arrived in June 1997. One of the other sole surviving Season 3 stories, The Ark, took 32 years and 7 months, its VHS release taking place in October of 1998. The aforementioned Space Museum shares a similar timeframe to The Crusade, at just over 34 years, whereas Season 1 story, The Keys of Marinus, took almost 35, finally arriving to video cassette in March 1999. We jump over another landmark, over 35 years now between the end of original broadcast and a release on VHS. Gee, Doctor Who fans back then must have had the patience of saints. Glad to see nothing's changed in the fandom as the years have worn on. First up is The Edge of Destruction, which was bundled together with the programme's unaired pilot episode in April of 2000, a huge 36 years and 2 months from its first screening in February 1964. The gap extends further with The Gunfighters, at 36.5 years when the videotape was issued in November of 2002. But now we move into our top 3, with the bronze being taken by Season 2 opener, Planet of Giants. One of my favourite Hartnell adventures, it holds a gap of 37 years and 2 months by the time the VHS appeared in January of 2002. It's just pipped to second slightly by the Season 2 closer, The Time Meddler, at 37 years and 4 months, with its VHS appearing in November 2002, which means our winner for the Hartnell era, and our overall winner for the longest gap between end of original broadcast and a release on VHS for a complete Doctor Who story, is The Sensorites. Now this was released as part of a special First Doctor box set in November of 2002. It also contained the aforementioned Time Meddler and The Gunfighters, but given that The Sensorites is a Season 1 story, it beats them both to the post. The gap it holds stands at 38 years and 3 months. So if you missed a few screenings on UK Gold during the 90s, and you'd watched the adventure back in 1964, you'd have to wait an agonising 38 years before not only being able to own the story, but to maybe see it again in general. This is a huge time frame, and boy doesn't it make you thankful for what we have nowadays. As I mentioned at the start of this video, us Doctor Who fans now have it so good. Our favourite programme is more accessible than ever, with every complete story, as well as a handful of partially surviving or missing adventures being released on physical home media, and even being available to stream if you have a UK subscription to BritBox or ITVX. So whilst we have much of Doctor Who's history at our fingertips, let's spare a moment and pay tribute to those fans from yesteryear, those who grew up with the programme from its initial beginnings and had to often wait a perilously long time before they'd be able to enjoy those adventures again, for their patience, dedication and loyalty to Doctor Who, which undoubtedly helped it continue, to return, and to thrive, alongside the new generation of fans today.
I don't know what we brought down in Mars Probe 7, but it certainly wasn't human.
If you've made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a like, and let me know down in the comments below which Doctor Who story were you most excited for to see a release on home media, be it classic or modern. Also, please do subscribe to AMTV Who if you enjoyed what you saw. I've been Adam Martin, and we'll see you on our next trip in the TARDIS.